Hello there. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make creatures for concept art in Blender, like this. Just a quick disclaimer, this tutorial is a shortened version of our more extensive course over on Gumroad. With that out of the way, let's get started. So before getting into Blender, then there's some questions I always try to ask myself before starting a creature. And those questions are, what is the world and what is the style? So the world would be something like, is it a fantasy world like Lord of the Rings, where there's dragons and mythical creatures? Or is it something like Star Wars with aliens and other weird things? And the style would be, is it realistic like in Avatar? Or is it something cartoony like in Monsters, Inc.? Because that will really help isolate what are the functions your creature can do, and what general design shape language can you utilize here, right? And these can also help inform your reference gathering, which I will really emphasize. I think it's a really good idea to find reference and use reference. For me, I gathered some images here and I'm using them together with the PureRef. And if you don't know PureRef, then I would recommend getting that. And I will just, along the process here, I'll just have PureRef on the right side on my secondary monitor. Additionally, if you are proficient in sketching or something like that, then you could also do a sketch, even just a simple one, just for that really core idea, can be helpful. I tend to do that, but sometimes I don't. And it doesn't really matter if you do it or not. It's just, it's a method, right? And you could even go as far as doing an anatomical breakdown, which I didn't do here until after I'd done the sculpt, but just to demonstrate that it can be done. But once we actually get into Blender, then the first things I'll do when making a creature like this is I will create what I call the primary forms or primary shapes. And these are really the most abstract version of your design. So it's with very limited shapes. Typically angular shapes is what I use, but you could use more rounded ones, that'd be fine. But just really limited shapes that still represent your creature. Right, so it's what's the minimum you can do where some people go, well, that represents your creature. It's what you see from far away on the horizon line, right? Is it bulky? Is it thin? What kind of a creature is it? How do I approach it, right? That's really what it is. I like to compare this the most to cave paintings, right? So cave paintings from the Ice Age, those early interpretations are really the most raw interpretation we have, right? They're almost just shapes that is really raw interpretation. And of course, because we're in Blender, we have the ability to do that in 3D, right? So it's a little bit of a different task than just do it in 2D, but generally starting flat and then going out is what I tend to do. And then I'll try to go into the three-dimensional space just in this raw building, and then get the feel of the creature there. After this, I will start blocking out what I call the skeletal forms, right? So the skeletal forms usually consist of the rib cage, the hip, and the skull. And this obviously only applies if your creature kind of follows that standard four-limbed creature model that we find on Earth. But otherwise, the idea here is that you've established the abstract forms in the previous steps, and now we're going to go in and start creating something that's more of a utility. So the skeletal forms will help you wrap around muscle material and other anatomical materials for your creature. So it helps build a little bit of volume. You can see how the ribcage here builds that rounded form and starts really defining the ribcage. But otherwise, it's more for wrapping things around muscle materials, etc. And just having it there and being wary of it, I think it really helps set up the right overlaps for your creature. At this point, I'll also go in and define some boxes for the joints and the knees, because those joints are so visible, like the bone itself is so visible. Then when I wrap the muscles around, having those boxes there really help get me to keep in mind that the joints need to be visible. And also things you can do here is, for example, for the skull, if you have some kind of big horns or some kind of crest or something, then that is also a time to kind of block that out and create that kind of form. And in general, anything that is like that, maybe it's a shell of a turtle or the horn of a rhino or something like that. Those things, I think, block those things out now so you can relate your anatomy to those elements. And technically in Blender, there's nothing, extraordinary about how it's done, right? It's just a sphere and some cubes with subdivisions, right? And then, because we're gonna merge everything later on, but keep them, if need be, then keep them loose and separate so you can move them around before you start merging everything. I tend to do that as much as possible. After you've done your skeletal masses, then we move on to the thing I call secondary forms. And secondary forms are really these muscle groupings, kind of large volumes that define your creature. So where the primary forms really define that abstract interpretation of a creature, the secondary forms are really going to define the silhouette, right? That's really where it comes down. And what I do there is I create these lumps, these kind of elongated, muscly lumps, and then I mirror them over the x-axis, and then I just start placing them into these groupings. They're not strictly anatomy, they are related to the anatomy, but they could also represent different volumes of the creature. And some of these lumps are just several muscles in one grouping, right? So I think this is where you need to define and maybe look at some reference and see how are these masses built up, right? And there's no like definitive science on how you divide these things up, right? You just got to start developing a feel for when is it secondary forms, when it's primary forms, or the next step, right? Like where do you do the cutoff point? And I think that's the point. You just do a cutoff point and you say, okay, this is the size of my volumes right now, and then start placing them. But then I'll take several of these, and I also turned on random colors in the shading properties so that I can see them all clearly overlapping, and I'm looking at the intersection points of the different muscles to see if I'm getting those right volumes that I want. And this is all just based on reference and experience with working with anatomy and looking at creatures, etc. And you could manipulate these volumes in something like sculpt mode, but I actually just use the mouse here. There's no real benefit to either. Maybe it's faster in the sculpt mode, but I actually like using the mouse because it keeps me free from automation. By automation, I mean when I use a stylus or a pen or something, then there's all these forms and shapes that come out naturally through my hand because of years of experience, right? And then it becomes this automatic behavior, and it can kind of do the job on its own, and I don't need to think about it. But if I just let the hand do a lot of the work, then it tends to end up making the same things. So if I can, I will actually try to use the mouse, because then I know I'll be using my head, because I don't have all this automation built into my hand when I'm using the mouse, for example. And it's a recommendation mode in the sense that if you struggle with your design, then try changing your mode of interaction. But overall, blocking out the muscle groupings like this, where you can keep everything loose and separate, it really helps, and I think it's really fast, and it lets me keep an overview of everything I'm doing, and doing it with the mouse works for me. This is also a point where an écrochet could really help you as a good reference. An écrochet is an anatomical model of a creature, usually of a human, but it could also be of an animal or something. And they usually show all the muscles and veins and stuff like this. At first, I think I really underestimated the power of this process. Spending the time and properly placing your muscle masses like this, like the secondary forms, really benefits the speed of your sculpting. And I think I really undervalued it before, but I ended up spending way more time during the sculpting process to define some of these volumes that were actually much easier to define with just these lumps. I think spend the time here, and also if you have holes and pockets in your model, you can always solve them during sculpting, but it's actually really beneficial to just take that extra bit of time here when everything is not connected and not one big stretchy mesh, to fill out those holes and and prepare it for the eventual sculpting process. So after we placed all of our muscle groupings, then I take a duplicate of everything and then I merge that duplicate. And this could now be ready for sculpting on top of. But the first things I'll do is just iterate on my design. I will just reevaluate, and I think take every opportunity you have to question your design, right? And here I have this new step where everything is merged, so I can move things around in a little bit of a different way, and it just creates this fresh layer. And after I've done these minor tweaks to the silhouette of the creature, then can actually start remeshing and going into sculpt mode. And remeshing is this function in sculpt mode. You'll see it up there in the top of the bar. Here I figure out some voxel size, and I try to not go too high on the voxel size. I still stay low, make sure that I'm concentrating on those big volumes. And I think I stay lower than most people. It's quite low. I'm looking at squares, you know, there's nothing smooth about the way I'm doing it. But this just ensures that I'm doing the big picture first and then slowly moving towards the minor details. And at this point I have moved over to using my graphics tablet while sculpting in Blender. The brushes themselves I use here in the beginning, I mostly use clay buildup and the grab tool, I think. Also a little bit of inflate if there are bigger holes that need to be filled out, then inflate is pretty good at that. And in general, the flow here will be using clay buildup to build up volume, inflate to build up a lot of volume, and then remeshing, right? So that function that is called remesh up there, that's the one I'm using. And then I'm not really changing the voxel size in the beginning. I'm just keeping it where it is. And then pressing Control R will let you just run that remesh. And it's very similar to something like Dynamesh in ZBrush. And then you just go through those iterations of applying the clay buildup brush, inflating here and there, grabbing to adjust the silhouette, and then remeshing. And that's kind of the flow here at this stage, back and forth. And when sculpting, I'm actually still in that secondary form stage, kind of. I'm not thinking about the specific anatomy, but we're moving a little bit closer to it. But I still try to keep everything big and bold. And this is really where I think you see the benefit of having placed all these volumes, because we're getting really, really close to the final creature that we need. And this is super essential when we're doing a concept for a creature. Then, because we're not going for 100%, right, we're going for the idea, then I think this method stands really, really strong. And it's a personal preference of mine. So now I've started to move more into actually doing the proper anatomy for our creature. And this is, once again, look at your reference, it will be super helpful. But I'm also using some additional brushes. I'm using the crease brush. I think it's quite nice. It pulls all the forms together. I'm using the draw sharp a little bit if I need a little bit of a different edge there. And I'm using the sculpt draw. So it's the sculpt draw, the draw sharp, the clay buildup, inflate still a little bit, less and less after filling all the pockets, and then this crease brush. And of course still the grab brush, right? But that's just an essential one. And the grab brush is on G, like everything else in Blender. And there you could also see me just increase the resolution for our mesh. So I moved above those, that pretty rough voxel size. I think I almost quadrupled the amount of space I have to move around. And that's because I feel confident in the forms and the shapes I have overall. We still have time and flexibility to change really big things. But I try to, stay true to my design and stick with that decision. A technique you might see me use is kind of this layered striped technique with the clay buildup. I think clay buildup is probably the one I use 80% of the time. And what I'll do is I'll create these strips along sort of the muscle fibers. So I look at a reference for the muscles, and then I see which direction the muscle fibers go, and then I imitate that with the clay buildup. It's a pretty natural way of doing it. It's pretty close to how I would draw it, and it's creating this anatomical look that helps build a foundation for just sculpting your creature. Here I'm really reevaluating my forms and shapes a lot again, right? It's constantly zooming out, zooming in, and then seeing, does it look right? Does it feel right? Does it have the right volume, etc. Spend the time on your joints, around your knees and your elbows. Like, those are really corner points of your creature. I think a general rule of thumb for me is that as long as I have strong joints, then everything in between those joints, they can be a little bit more loose and overall less defined. And generally it doesn't work as well the other way around. If you have these kind of loose muscly masses, but your joints are weak and they feel soft, it just doesn't read. But having looser muscle masses can always be traded off as added fat or that specific form for the creature. But the joints, if they don't feel solid and kind of have this tactile, functional feeling, then the whole thing kind of just it doesn't feel right. So spend the time getting that right and making it feel believable. Here I also just switched to another matte cap just to see my volumes a bit better. I typically like something on the edge of metallic, kind of a shiny clay. I think that's where I find that it's easiest to see the forms, but you can obviously do what you prefer. You will also just add some spheres for the eyes, and I think it's a good idea to have that base eye sphere model to then wrap your eyelids and your other kind of facial anatomy around. It's just becomes a little bit difficult if you don't have the thing. You can do it, but then your creature becomes more of a sculpture maybe than kind of this concept model, right? There's a little bit of a difference there, but it depends on what you're doing, of course. Around this point is when I moved into what I call the tertiary forms. So after we kind of done these muscles and anatomy throughout the creature, then the tertiary forms are everything that is related to anatomy, of course, but more like skin folds, horns, extremities like toenails and paws, all these things and facial features also. So the things that are not the muscle masses. It's just I like keeping the muscle masses separate as its own stage because it's such a big part of the creature. But then thinking more in details with these like skin folds and horns and etc. Around here, I was overall done with sculpting my creature, and I wanted to move on. So I did a last kind of design check, right, where I pulled out some big shapes, as you can see here, in different parts of the creature, kind of emphasizing them. And I actually stacked them up as shape keys in the mesh properties, in the properties panel. Mesh shape keys are nice because you can kind of store these layers of mesh modifications, and then you can scroll them back and forth and really see if these big design changes make a difference. And at this point I was ready to just commit to the design I already had, but I wanted to see what else could be done, and there was things that were interesting and they could have been used for maybe just variations of the creature, not necessarily like a different design, but just I decided to be boring and stick with my design, and actually went back and did a few more details after having seen the bigger shapes. Then I went in and just sculpted everything a little bit more fine. When I had the creature completely finished sculpt-wise, then I actually brought it into Blender 3.00 Alpha, and that's because that is where Sculpt Vertex colors are available. I haven't seen a lot of people use Sculpt Vertex colors. I think they're really intriguing. They're like polypaint in ZBrush, and essentially just let you paint on your model without having to create UVs and proper topology and all these things. And it's pretty fast. And here I just, I looked at some African animals, and here I found a color scheme to fit my creature. And I kind of imagined it to live in a savanna-like environment, so pretty warm, a bit dry with periods of floods, and then I was imagining what kind of bushes would be around for the creature to hide in, and then that would maybe help define its pattern on its body. And I actually ended up really liking the result. I think I was pretty happy that I didn't go too extreme with the design shapes themselves, and that I stuck a little bit more moderate, because when I brought in this more realistic color scheme, then it just came together in the way I was hoping, and that was pretty rewarding to see. And also, having spent the time doing the volumes properly, then seeing it in color is always a nice thing, because it just sort of fits. and it makes it a lot more fun to paint the creature. After painting the creature, I created a little environment using bridge and megascans, and did a quick set of lighting, and then I brought everything into Photoshop, where I just went ham with creating skies and adding birds and adjusting the lighting a little bit here and there, and here we have the final result. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and once again, if you want to learn more about creating creatures, then you should check out our creature concept art in Blender tutorial over on Gumroad. This is a much more extensive course on creating creatures in Blender, and it will create the quad raptor that we see before us. It will pose, it will texture, it will sculpt it, will do the whole thing, and we'll combine it with the creature from this tutorial to create this epic master shot of the two titans clashing here. All that can be found in the description below. If you like this video, leave a like. If you want to see more from us, subscribe. That's it for now, and bye.